Did God create a group of divine creatures that surround him in the heavens? Well, this week we're going to talk about actually a scandal that erupted on the internet where a friend of mine wrote an article critiquing and appreciating some of Mike Heiser's work on the issue of the sons of God language in Deuteronomy 32, about that referring to a divine council, which maybe you've heard of the divine council worldview or Mike Heiser's work, The Unseen Realm. He got a lot of blowback, including from famous influencers. In this episode, we're going to talk to Dr. Jamie Duguid, who is an ancient Near Eastern and Hebrew Bible scholar, who is going to talk us through what the issues are with this one phrase, sons of God, bene Elohim. Just that one little phrase, what you think it means can actually determine whether you think that God is surrounded by a bunch of other gods, or whether God is the only God. Okay, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty detail of the Hebrew text, Greek translations, Syriac translations, Aramaic translations, Coptic translations, and how those might help us reveal what the original Hebrew actually said. This is a long one, so buckle up. And by the way, I'm completely aware that we both happen to be wearing almost the exact same shirt. That was an accident. If you appreciate what we do here at the Center for Hebraic Thought, the Biblical Mind podcast, you can like and subscribe. You can rate us if you're willing to give us 5 stars. We will send you $5 in the mail for that. You can just send us your postal mail address. Just put it on the back of a Milwaukee miter saw, and you write it on there and mail that to me, and then I will send you $5 for a 5-star review. Otherwise, you can also give to us. Recurring gifts are always appreciated. That helps keep us afloat at thebiblicalmind.org/give. And now to the scandal.
This is the Biblical Mind podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
So, a colleague of ours, Rick Wadham, an Old Testament scholar, wrote this review of Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm, and it was really a review of the methodology of that book, where Michael Heiser most famously makes an argument that God manages over a realm of divine beings that are created, unlike God, who is not created, they are created, and that, and then he uses a couple places in the Old Testament to justify that move, and then he kind of moves out to discuss, okay, what are angels, what are demons, what are these fallen creatures, where the serpent comes from, and essentially is trying to describe from an ancient Near Eastern perspective why the world is populated with these spiritual beings that he thinks they're populated with. Is that how you understand his book as well?
Yeah, and I think he's connecting into a lot of these passages that we sometimes forget or skip over or give different interpretations that seem to use the word God to apply to people other than Yahweh. And his explanatory framework is, this is the divine council. Who are these other gods? They're other heavenly beings is a way of talking about them. Maybe we would be more comfortable with terms like angels or demons for the bad ones, and that would make us, that's how we talk about it in church. But when you open to the Old Testament, it doesn't follow those rules. Sometimes it calls them gods.
Yeah. And this word Elohim is the most common term for God, the God of Israel, I think, in the Hebrew Bible. By the numbers, it's the most common term. It's a funky term to begin with because it's plural. It actually is the word gods. What's your take on that? I mean, you do a lot in ancient Near East and Egyptology, and
yeah. So when you're teaching Hebrew class, you see come to Elohim. You've already taught them the im is the plural, so it looks like a plural noun, but then it will take singular agreement.
Right.
So the noun singular, the adjective singular, usually.
Yes. Everything is usually in Hebrew.
Yeah. So what's going on there is we have this sort of plurality being treated as a single being. I mean, I think some older scholars wanted to say, this is like a kind of like ancient polytheism that's sort of been papered over. But it's a little bit too consistent for that to be totally convincing.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually like a sort of plural of majesty sort of explanation. That occasionally you have, like, for instance, Behemoth in Job, who's this monster. It's just Behemah, beast, sort of like pluralized. There's other ways to explain that. It could be another ending, but so it's the mother of all beasts, right? So,
Right.
the biggest one. So I like that the best. People will say there's not a ton of evidence for plural majesty in Semitic languages, but there actually is some that's neglected and enough to make me think that kind of works.
Yeah, and in that book, Jennifer Singletary's book, she actually gives some examples of divine determinatives where sometimes you have a double determinative it's a dual deity, but it gets treated as one in there. So there's possibility that this is just a convention for some people in the ancient Near East. Certainly, I mean, when you're in Genesis 1, if you're opening up, intro to New or Old Testament, it's like the third word you have to deal
Yeah.
with, right? And each of those three words is controversial in their own peculiar ways. Yeah, so we do have this term Elohim that refers to God, and then we do have let us make man in our image, right? And so there is some toggling here where you see some plurality in God, and the image of God is male and female, so it's a plural something going on there. So I always say even for the ancient Hebrew, it might not be exactly clear what's going on with this kind of use of singular verbs with plural nouns and plural descriptions. Um, I also noticed that this idea of there's this divine council of beings, of Elohim. The confusing part here is we're going to have to, in Hebrew, we would call these things Elohim, which is also
Right.
the singular name of God. That's where it gets who is like our God amongst the gods, who is like our Elohim amongst the Elohim, right? It's the same word that shows up here.
I will say there is also sons of God
Right.
and holy
Yeah.
ones, kadoshim.
Yeah,
So, there's
Kedoshim.
some
Yeah.
other terminology that you could,
Yeah.
if you wanted to.
Yeah. And that actually becomes part of the debate as well, because what is a son of God?
Mhm.
Surprisingly, I never put 1 ounce of thought into this at all the way through seminary, all the way through pastorate, 8 years, never thought about this once until I started teaching college, and students were like, "Those are aliens, right?" Or,
Yeah.
"Those are fallen creatures." I was like, "What are you talking about?" Well, Genesis 6, those are clearly, like, fallen creatures, and I'm like, "Where are you getting this from?" I always read that as humans, right? And so I never even had thought about it as anything other than human by that point. But yeah, you do have this reference to a collection. Psalm 82 would be another place here. I said to you, to the Elohim. I still read that one as human rulers. I haven't been persuaded
Okay.
otherwise, but I could be. I'm open to it. I just haven't been persuaded. But I guess why is this a big deal that, Rick Wadham's critique of Michael Heiser's book? Well, how did you read his critique? Who cares about my opinion?
I mean, I did. Because I think there's a lot of legitimate critiques of Heiser, especially because he pushes the thesis as far as it can go, which is some
Right.
way, it's a good thing for a scholar to do, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit his personality as well, from what I understand. So, which is
Okay, yeah.
fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot rolled into it by the end of it. I really focused in on Deuteronomy 32. But part of the reason is, first of all, I'm an Isaiah 40 through 66 scholar. That's my focus. Deuteronomy 32 is probably the most important, maybe one of maybe the most important text that is alluded to in that corpus. It's like
Hmm.
over and over again. So it's a text I used to spend a
Oh,
lot of.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's actually really interesting if you're talking about gods.
Yes.
Maybe we
Oh,
can
yeah.
come.
Especially in that section of Isaiah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we can come back to that at some point. But so I also have found some of his comments on Deuteronomy 32, Heiser's comments, very enlightening with just how it might be echoed throughout the Old Testament and even into the New Testament. I actually use the passage in Deuteronomy 32 we have an issue with as an example of where looking at different manuscripts is important in class, because it changes part of how you understand the passage. So I zoomed in on that. I think that there's a lot of validity to the critique that, like, some of these places where Heiser sees the divine council, maybe there's no divine council or there's other ways to read it. But I actually think it's very hard to avoid these other gods in Deuteronomy 32, and it links into the whole theme of the nations and what's going on with the nations in the whole
Right.
Pentateuch. It connects back to Genesis 6, which then we have a whole nother argument about. But so I actually think it's structurally important for the Pentateuch. I mean, you can argue Deuteronomy 4 says something pretty similar to what Heiser is saying Deuteronomy 32
Right.
said. But I think that one verse is pretty important for both the themes of other heavenly beings and the themes of the nations in the whole Pentateuch and then the Bible as a whole.
So maybe we should just pull that up here.
Yeah.
That's Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. So this is poetry. This is the song that Moses is supposed to teach all of Israel, which hardly any Christian knows. The one thing that all of Israel was supposed to know, according to Deuteronomy. Verse 8, and I'm just going to read the ESV because it's the first one that popped up on my screen. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. And then I have a little footnote here compared to the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Septuagint with the Masoretic Text. Sons of God is the phrase of interest here. So A, what's the plain sense, if you take this to refer to the divine council, what's the plain sense in which you think you would read that statement?
Yeah, so we've had the table of the nations in Genesis 10. So we've had, God creates humanity, and then, he really wants them to become a bunch of nations. He messes with the Tower of Babel to make that happen.
Right.
But here we have him sort of dividing this inheritance up, and all of these nations get assigned to this group of supernatural beings called the sons of God. And this is important for what follows in verse 9, for the portion of Yahweh is his people, Jacob is the portion of his inheritance. So unlike all the other nations who are sort of overseen by these heavenly beings, Yahweh himself is in relationship with Jacob or Israel. So, after Genesis 10, it doesn't seem like the flood fixed everything. We still have problems. But God ends up calling Abraham, entering this special relationship with Abraham, and it's different than the people's. Biblically, theologically, this connects to a lot of stuff. I especially remember after the golden calf, God comes to Moses with this whole scheme saying, hey, what if instead of me going with you, because this whole sin, my holiness, your sin is a problem, what if I send an angel instead? And Moses says, no, if you don't come, let's not do the thing at all. And God says, you're right. I myself am going to go with you. That comes back in Isaiah 63 again, by the way. That's emphasized there. That God doesn't lead Israel, like, not that there aren't angels involved throughout all of Israel's history, but that God doesn't give Israel over to the custody of one of these angelic figures, but he himself is specially involved with them.
Yeah, and even at this point, I realize we already need to distinguish for some people. When we say angel, I actually avoid the word angel altogether now because it just conjures all the wrong images, right? But the word is actually messenger, malach, right? And so that would be textually distinct. Like I don't think there's any point where they're confusing angels and malachim and Elohim in the Masoretic text.
If you're just looking across the Masoretic text, I do think there's an interesting wrinkle with Jacob's wrestling.
Okay.
Who does he wrestle with? Is it an angel? Is it God? Even in the way Hosea looks back to it.
Okay.
Sometimes, the angel of the Lord is sometimes there, and then the Lord speaks. So there's a little bit of...
What is an Elohim? What is what are malachim? These messengers. Messengers typically show up in the form of a human that sits down and eats with somebody. But the burning bush is also the messenger of Yahweh, who speaks from the burning bush. So they can take different forms. Elohim also doesn't just refer to divine beings or humans. It gets positioned in a lot of different ways, including, I think there's some oblique references that the stars are like Elohim in some places as well. So there's even a fuzzy boundary on the term Elohim in the Hebrew as to what all can get called. A friend of mine, Yaakov Gericka, I don't know if you know Yaakov, but he wrote a paper called What is an El, where he kind of outlined every single instance of El and Elohim and all the different things that it can apply to nations, peoples, etc. It is a slightly elastic word to begin with. And then you have malachim, which it's unclear what these creatures are. You have the serpent at the beginning, which it's unclear what exactly is going on there. The only other talking animal you have is the ass in Numbers. And this is what I think will be important for our discussion here, is the biblical authors never really talk about where these creatures came from, where are these people who are Satanim, who are opposed to God. We don't know where they came from, right?
Right.
We don't know their story. There's these infamous stories of the fall of the third of the angelic host, and Satan was the most beautiful of all his devils or whatever, his angels. But those are all hundreds and hundreds of years later stories from right before the time of Jesus. I think it would be good for us to admit we are dealing with vast silences in the biblical text that various people and traditions have tried to fill in these gaps in various ways over Jewish history. Would that be fair?
I think it's very fair. You can try to find a lot of the readings of biblical text that people will say are about this turn out to be maybe allegorical, not, if you look at the text in context, it's not talking about that. Like the day star falling, it's talking about a
Right.
king rather than,
Right.
an angelic being. And even when you get to the New Testament, when you hear Second Peter start in Second Peter about the fall of the angels, and we all think we know what he's talking about, maybe it's actually probably talking about the flood and the sons of God in Genesis 6, right?
Okay.
So where did they come from? Like, what's the creation story and how did things first go wrong? It's not really, I don't think, clearly answered. I will say, as far as creation in Isaiah 40 through 55, they're described, the host of heaven seem like possibly, like you mentioned with the stars, possibly somewhat angelic figures. And they're created with the heavens. So you could try to get at the answer that way. But then it's not obvious that everybody who's called a god is included in the host of heaven.
Well, okay, so this brings me to a big picture question before we drill down on the details. How do you think about, as a pastor, you're a pastor as well, how do you think about, do we really need to map all of this out? Or is it one of those phenomenological things, like if you run into a messenger of God, you're going to know it. If you run into a demon opposed to God, or you're going to know it, kind of a thing. It's more of a phenomenological issue that they weren't interested in mapping out what we call the ontologies, the nature of the existence of all of these things.
Yeah, well, we don't have like a book of angelic hierarchies in the Bible that then gives us, there have been some very creative attempts in church history to
I was
infer
going to
it.
say, we do have several books that do that,
Not
yeah,
a
but not
canonical
in the
book,
Bible.
but yeah. So I think you got like the author to the Hebrews telling his audience, you care too much about angels.
Mm,
Um, on the other hand, you have Second Peter again. We're in Second Peter; it's on the brain. Jude and Second Peter saying, "Oh well, you should respect these these heavenly powers, and it's
right.
not good to reproach them." I don't know. I think we might today, in our very desupernaturalized world, we might lean too far on the other side,
Mm,
because the Bible does actually have a lot to say about these other supernatural beings. So I wouldn't, I think I try to talk to congregants about this by saying we want to try to find a balance here. And I think part of what's even going on with Heiser, and part of why Heiser resonates, is he's talking about this, and he's
mhm,
finding all of these things in the Bible that connect about where this is something we just sort of skim over or don't really talk about in church, but people find it in the Bible. And that's why I think that's the biggest reason Heiser is so popular,
yeah.
is that he's unfolding all the stuff you never heard of. Maybe, not everything he says is 100% solid, but he's really actually getting into this sort of issue, and people want to know about it.
Yeah, and we should be clear, he's not just some guy who studied in his garage and came to all these conclusions. I mean, I think his PhD is out of UW-Madison. By the way, the other people we should note, another group of people that really like the Divine Council worldview is Tim Mackey in the Bible Project.
Mhm.
And he also went to UW, University of Wisconsin-Madison as well. I recently talked to another UW graduate. I was like, "Is there something in the water over there? Is this like you have to have this view?" And he said, "No, that was just a period, where some people were toying with those ideas and marketing them." So, okay. Before we dive in the details, big picture, what does it matter if there is or isn't a divine council?
Um, I don't want to overinflate the importance of it, because much of the story of the Bible is going to be the same whether you take this view or not. If God had wanted it to be a little clearer in Genesis 1 or Isaiah 40 that this was a divine council, it could have been. I think I would go back again, though, to this idea of God's covenant presence with Israel, contrasted with the nations and this supernatural power that is behind evil. And I'm going to just
Mhm.
say, just broadly with this theme, which again, I don't think you need the divine counsel for it, but it certainly helps us see it. It does make a big difference in how you're even thinking about evil in the world, if there are supernatural powers behind it or not. When you
Right.
get to Exodus, God doesn't just beat Pharaoh. He beats the gods of Egypt, as the text
Right.
says.
Yeah.
So, and then when you get to the New Testament, and now the situation has changed, and now the gospel is going out to the nations, and we find this power over demons, right? And I actually agree with Heiser, I think, and this is the connection he wants to make. That is this Deuteronomy 32, this divine council are now being dethroned because, they're demonic or become demonic or something. They're being dethroned by the gospel. And this is kind of even the point of a lot of the exorcisms in the New Testament, is that the spiritual power behind the power of the world is being overthrown by the gospel of Christ.
Yeah, and we call it spiritual power, which is not inappropriate, but it's also labeled with political terms as well. He's the prince of the air, right?
Yeah.
And it's the kingdom of God. And so they do portray it under the analogy of a political battle, to maybe just to make more sense to what's going on. Okay, very helpful. Now, let's talk about this very nerdy technical issue that most people won't be aware of. Let's just start with, what is the Masoretic Text, and then work ourselves out from there, because the Masoretic Text is mainly what most Old Testament English translations are based off of for the Old Testament. Yeah.
So if you are living before 1900, Masoretic Text is the Hebrew Bible that you have, more or less. Maybe if you're very dialed in, you've heard about a Samaritan text, but you probably
Okay.
just know about the
Yeah.
Masoretic Text, which is the manuscripts that have come down from the medieval period. They have been with the property of the Jewish people until and about a little after the time of the Reformation. Suddenly, everybody got interested in learning Hebrew. So, Christian scholars have been, going to Jewish scholars and actually trying to, not want to depend on the Latin Vulgate. They're going back and they're reading Hebrew, and one of the things that they'll find is that it's actually a very uniform text. If they compare different Hebrew manuscripts, there's some differences, but there's not that many. It's pretty pristine. And, today we actually, looking at all of them, we have some that go back to the 10th century AD, so about 1,000 years old at this point. So we have some very old ones that anchor us with the text back. So imagine you're reading, you have they know their Greek, they know their Latin, they're reading the Greek. It often is creative and different. And Jerome did a great job translating the Hebrew into the Latin overall, but he wasn't perfect either. There's differences there. Now they want to say, let's go back to the sources, let's go back to the Hebrew. And what they have is this collection of Hebrew manuscripts, which we think all go back to one original, a choice probably made around the time of Jesus, maybe a century before, where the majority of people get on this bandwagon of these are the best copies, and they put it together, and that is the only thing that comes down to us from that point. And, again, there's minor differences. There's some places where you look at Jerome or the Syriac translation, and it's different from the Masoretic text that we have several centuries later, but it's pretty similar overall.
It's in some ways remarkably similar. Like, you have to explain the scribal practice to explain the similarities between some of these copies. Okay, so that's what, when you're reading an English translation, your translator is probably mainly working off of that text and then looking at variations in some of these other texts. So let's talk about some of these other texts. First, in Hebrew, what are the other options available in the Hebrew language that we know now?
Yes. Well, so I want to mention the Samaritan Pentateuch. So the Samaritan community they don't believe in the rest of the old, what we call the Old Testament, just the books of Moses, but they have their own version of it. It has some changes that seem very theologically motivated, like they believe that the place to worship God should be in Gerizim, and it just says that.
Yeah.
However, once you account for that, it also has a lot of other variances that don't seem at all theologically motivated, which we believe go way back. So this is another tradition separate from the Masoretic tradition. And, when we think about manuscript stuff, we often say that witnesses should be weighed, not counted. Somebody could copy a Masoretic manuscript 15 times, but that wouldn't be 15 new pieces of evidence. If you have a tradition that's old, that branched off a long time ago, that's more important. So that's really cool. They've had this thing. It's been separate we don't really know exactly when or where it came from, but it seems to go way back. So that's important.
It's in its own script and dialect of Hebrew as well.
It is its own script.
Yeah.
What was that?
Is Samaritan a dialect? Is that, according to philology, would it be considered a dialect?
Yeah. It's interesting for Samaritan Hebrew. I mean, definitely there's, northern Israeli and Hebrew, and there's definitely Samaritan Aramaic. I'm less certain about what kind of status Hebrew has as a living language. I mean,
Okay.
certainly for the Pentateuch, it's pretty much the same as the classical biblical Hebrew we love and know.
And also interesting about the Samaritans is they still give animal sacrifices on Mount Gerizim to Yahweh, and I've got to attend one of those once when I was living in Israel. It was fascinating to see how they interpret the Torah's sacrificial teaching, which you ultimately realize, oh, there's hardly enough teaching in there to tell you anything to do when you sacrifice an animal, and most of it is improvisation or according to what everybody who sacrifices and slaughters animals knows. Okay, so they're still practicing a tradition. We have this, it comes from before the time of Jesus. We don't know how early it is, but it branches off early, and it has variations from the Masoretic Text that don't seem to have any motivation for them. They just happen to be. Would that be in a lot of the ritual material, or is it the
Just
narrative?
throughout.
Just okay, little things
So
here. And
it's what we think happened is that this is just a different text tradition than the one that got chosen and people decided was best in the Jewish community around the time of Jesus. They just picked a different one. Whatever changes they made were to that one. And
okay,
so it goes way back. And I will say overall, scholars say that there are a lot of easier reading changes. So like if there's something difficult or rough about the text, they're more likely to fix it. So we're a little careful. But
okay.
some of the readings, all in all, are probably the original reading. There are probably places where the Samaritan Pentateuch has the original reading, and the one we have in the Masoretic Text is the change.
Wow, interesting. Okay. And then we also have this, probably the biggest contender in the room, which is the Septuagint or Septuagints. I don't know what we should call it, but the Greek translation, which I heard someone say one time, the actual oldest physical copies we have of any Old Testament text outside of the amulets is in Greek, not Hebrew. Is that correct? Have you heard that?
That what the oldest we have period, or
Yeah, the oldest fragments would be from the Septuagint, not actually from the Hebrew text. I don't know, but
I've never actually mapped that out. But
yeah.
there are manuscripts of the Old Testament in Greek that predate Jesus.
And
So
this
there's some
this
old
does
ones.
not mean that the Old Testament was actually written in Greek and it was a conspiracy to hide it. We're just saying these are the texts that we have on hand.
Cool kids call it the Old Greek rather than the Septuagint.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, first of all, we do think one main authoritative translation of all the books happened at first. That's what we usually mean by the Old Greek. We are reconstructing that text critically, right? We don't, have that. When you find it's interesting, when you find the oldest copies we have, many of them are actually after that. Many of those old copies we have are already different from what we reconstruct as the original translation. And what's interesting is that most of the differences correct it towards the Masoretic Text where it veered off.
Interesting.
So
And
what we think is Jews,
yeah, go ahead.
Jews in Alexandria, maybe starting 3rd century or so, start translating, probably start with the Pentateuch, translate this thing into Greek. They do is often very nice literary Greek. Sometimes it's more literal, sometimes it's less. And then the trend from that point on is that people will come back and correct it. And the two big driving things for a lot of the corrections are we want it to be more literal, and so they'll correct to make it more literal. And it seems to be we want it to look like the Masoretic text. So there are 3 great translators who are a couple centuries after the time of Christ that we know about. But when we get these brief little windows into the old ones, it's evidence to other attempts to correct the translation that we don't really know where those came from and what they're about. That's, by the way, some of the evidence for the idea that around the time of Jesus, every solidified on the Masoretic text is the Septuagint is using something different from the Masoretic text. I should probably just unpack that a bit. So it's in Greek, but they translated it from a Hebrew original. And so our interest in it is not just for how they translated it, but if their Hebrew original looked different than the Masoretic text.
Right.
Are they reading something different? Which means we have to guess by back translating it what they're reading. There is a wrinkle there. We might mistake something the translator is doing for a difference in the text when it's really just the translator stuck with as bad a text as we have doing their best.
Yeah, these reconstructions are, well, anybody who grades papers knows something about this. I mean, it's essentially you're looking at different texts that have variations between them, and you're trying to figure out how do they arrive at these variations. And the same thing when you have two students' papers that look exactly alike, and you're like, I wonder who copied off of who, right? And then you use a couple of techniques to figure out, oh, okay, this person copied off of this person. Okay, so you're trying to reconstruct. We have a Greek translation, the Old Greek, that helps
later, and some later Greek translators sticking their or in as well, and we'll put them on the table.
Yeah, and like you said, you can both kind of work backwards towards maybe what Hebrew was sitting in front of them. Or you also, translations are interpretations, so you also get a window into like what they thought the text was saying as well. And sometimes it's very helpful. Sometimes it's wild and perplexing. I can't figure out what they're doing. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's difficult to figure out sometimes. Okay, how does that come to bear on this issue of the sons of God and Michael Heiser?
Okay, well, there's one more big elephant to bring in, which is the Dead Sea
Oh,
Scrolls.
yeah, we didn't even talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah, we should talk about that.
I keep assuring everybody that the Greek is based off of a different Hebrew manuscript and that the Samaritan tradition is old and things like that. What really nails this down is the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we find a bunch of Hebrew manuscripts in the desert, in jars in a cave. Some of them are here in D.C., by the way.
Yeah, Museum of the Bible now.
In town, we should visit.
Yeah, they're found in caves right next to the largest collection of desiccant in the world, the Dead Sea, right?
Yes. So, I mean, these things have surprised, sometimes you get grumpy because the worm has eaten the one part of the scroll you cared about, but these things have survived for like over 2,000 years really well. And there's a bunch of biblical manuscripts. And even if there were people at the time who thought they just wanted the Masoretic Text, that doesn't describe this community. They have a diversity of biblical manuscripts, and some of those look like the Masoretic Text. Some of them look like the Septuagint. Like, you'll look at it and be like, oh, if you had that Hebrew, you would translate the way the Septuagint did, which is different.
Okay, yeah.
So now you're like, at least it's not all in my head.
Yeah.
When I thought the Septuagint had a better text, in certain instances, I can prove it. And some of them look like the Samaritan tradition, which presumably, and these are not Samaritans, right? So presumably they have that version of the Samaritan tradition without the Samaritan edits. And then some of them are what we call non-aligned, which means they're completely out in a different direction. So beyond just giving us a bunch of the oldest Hebrew manuscripts we have, these texts also give us a very wide look at different textual traditions, so they're more likely to have interesting differences.
Yeah, okay. So now lest people think that their Bible is completely untrustworthy and they should throw it in the trash, let's look at a variation here. Considering, so sons of God in Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, what is the width of variation here? Like how flexible is what's going on in these translations?
Yeah, so what we have is a variation on whether it's sons of God or sons of Israel, according to whom, the nations are divided. So the Masoretic Text says sons of Israel. So do the later Greek translators, who we think are using the proto-Masoretic text. So does Jerome and the Syriac and the Targums, the Aramaic translations, but we also think they're using proto-Masoretic text. So the Masoretic text and the things based upon it all go in this sons of Israel direction. So does the Samaritan Pentateuch, but the Old Greek, is hanging out here saying sons of God. Actually, I should be more specific. It might say sons of God. It might say angels of God. We actually have both of those readings in the tradition.
And huion, right? Yeah, huioi.
Which we could debate about exactly. It's actually not clear which is earlier than which. We have one of those early Greek manuscripts, Papyrus Fa'ud, has sons of, and then it's broken. Did it have sons of God? Did it have sons of Israel? But it didn't have angels.
Yeah.
If whichever reading is earlier, the other one's probably sons or angels. They're both pretty old. So there's the Greek. I mean, the Greek so far, the Old Greek is standing alone against everybody else. In comes the Dead Sea Scrolls. The only extant copy of this that we have at the Dead Sea Scrolls says sons of God, bene Elohim. And so we have the Proto-Masoretic text and all of its followers, and the Samaritan Pentateuch on one side, and we have the Old Greek, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls on the other side, which kind of looks like a tie. I mean, really,
Right.
it's. I mean, we can.
This is
We have.
soccer,
We
we
might.
would just
We
go
can't just
home.
do the vote here and get
Yeah,
an
yeah.
answer.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're talking about the difference between sons of God versus sons of Israel. So that would kind of denaturalize it into maybe divided up between the 12 or something. Or angels of God. Is it angels of God or angels? It can't be angels of Israel. It would be angels of God or
So, it would be sons of God, and angels of God would be following or angel. Sorry, just angels simpliciter. I think in the
yeah. Oh, okay,
in
just
the
angels. Okay.
Septuagint. I'm not sure if it's angels. I think I have it here.
Well, and the other thing that comes to mind is just because I've been working on an article on the Dead Sea Scroll and I was working particularly on Hodayot and the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice. You notice there's a lot of like spirit, angel. There's a lot of swapping going on in these terms.
Yes. So it's sons of God or angels of God in the Greek.
Okay.
But we know the Greek translators, sometimes they just translated sons of God dead on in various, like in Psalm 29 or Genesis 6. But sometimes, like in Job, they did angels instead,
Okay.
angels of God. So yeah, like you mentioned, there's that variation at Qumran. There's that variation in different Greek. Maybe it's different translators or different contextual reasons why, but they'll do it
Yeah.
either way.
And and I think it's fair to say, and I think this is Rick's point, is that when you get into the Dead Sea Scroll community, now this is the big question of the biblical text versus what the community is writing. They have a highly developed angelology compared to anything in the Hebrew Bible, or at least they're talking about it more explicitly. And so yeah, they are probably going to think more in terms of angels and spirits than they do in this kind of more naturalized language of. Well, I don't even know if it's naturalized. The sons of God language, right? And so that he's saying maybe there's a bias towards towards their angelology in these traditions. What would be the problem with that claim?
Was certainly worth considering. Because we have this big group of texts from Jews who lived at the same time of Jesus. We love the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we do have to remember this is a sectarian group. That's sometimes they'll say something that's like word for word, almost something you find in Paul or something. You're like, oh, that's interesting. I want to think about that.
Yeah.
But other times they'll say something like, to join the community, you have to love everybody inside the community, hate everybody outside of it. You're
Right.
like, oh, okay, wow. So, and you're right that they are super interested in the Book of Enoch. They're super interested in they love to use the language of sons of God or just gods in reference to angelic or demonic powers. And they do that a lot. So there's a reason to think the community might be interested in this textual reading. However, it's also worth saying that the fact that it shows up in the Old Greek, that's a very influential. That's not a sectarian group. It's still a group of Jews in Alexandria, but the translation they wrote gets very widely adopted. So I think we need to be a little careful. The fact that so many things in the Dead Sea Scrolls link out to, say, the Samaritan Pentateuch or the Greek mean that their Bible that they have is probably in many cases the same sort of Bible other people are reading.
Yeah. So this is where it gets complicated. Now we have most of the evidence on the table, and we're just kind of looking, going, well, which one do we weight more heavily? Oldest, maybe the temptation is to say, well, which one's the oldest? And that's the one we go with. But you're saying there's actually all these other factors that play in here. You have the Dead Sea Scrolls community, and the Dead Sea Scroll, the biblical texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls don't necessarily come from that community either, right? So some of these scrolls are coming in from the outside and being stored there. So we don't necessarily know that they reflect the Dead Sea Scroll community's extremist views, I think would be a fair statement. They do have some fairly extreme views. And the Old Greek that's being translated in what we call the Septuagint, or what you call the Septuagint, which I just can't bring myself to do, comes from one particular community in North Africa, in Alexandria, of seemingly a very educated group of Jews who are basically writing the text that is going to be read probably by more Jews around the world than the Hebrew and any one of these Hebrew texts, right? Okay.
They're also mentioned that community in Alexandria is also on the inside track of this looking at different manuscripts thing.
Okay.
Right? Like this discipline of looking at the text is invented to study Homer.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And
Nice.
Alexandria is one of the centers of this.
Yeah.
And so, like that's what the folks in Alexandria are, I think world-class textual scholars. So that's
Right.
one thing to say for them.
It's not just a random group of rabbis who got, yeah. It's good to know. You also mentioned the Syriac translation, so can you put that one in context for us?
Sure. So some of the translations we find in the early church just take the Greek and translate it, right? So if I'm reading like the Coptic, the Egyptian Coptic translation, then it's not telling me about the Hebrew text; it's telling me about the Greek text. But it's a little mysterious who exactly made this translation. Some group of Syriac-speaking people, probably Christians, so even that's debated, make a translation, which, again, people debate on the date, but some people put it very early, and their translation of the there's a translation of the New Testament, but the translation of the Old Testament is actually based on the Hebrew. So that's
Okay.
great. That means that it's giving us, now it is a proto-Masoretic form of the Hebrew, but you kind of put it alongside Jerome as like, I get this window into maybe 2nd to 6th century. I can sort of see what's happening with the proto-Masoretic text through these translations that are checking in on it.
Yeah, and Syriac is a Western Semitic language.
It's kind of
It would
Aramaic,
be,
yeah.
yeah, kind of Aramaic, which is also a kinship language to Hebrew, which is a kinship language to later Arabic, and these are all in the same language group. Which is why everybody should learn Hebrew, because you can get a window into all these other languages, including Kiswahili, just by learning a little bit of Hebrew. Okay. So at the end of the day, what is you weigh all of it? You've spent a lot. This is your area, textual
Yeah.
studies. You weigh all of these things. What would be if somebody was asking me like, okay, just give me the beef here. What is it? How would you assess what's going on in Deuteronomy 32?
Well, one other way that we can come at it is internal probability. So we ask which of these is most likely to be a result of the other one being changed. I will say there's a lot of stuff with other spiritual forces going on in Deuteronomy 32, so there's already a little bit more of a sense to think that that's what's going on. It's actually a little hard to spin out what it means for the nations to be numbered according to the sons of Israel. I mean, there's roughly 70 nations, and there ends up being roughly 70 people at the end of Genesis going down into Egypt.
Right.
So we think that might be the connection, but then where do you go from there? Like, what does it mean? So I think that like the Sons of God reading just makes more sense textually. But the big thing that sways me towards Heiser's view here is actually that there's another plot thickens. There's another other gods issue in the same chapter at verse
Right.
43.
Yeah, at the very end there.
So
Here, I'll read this.
Yeah, go for it.
Rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods. I assume that's Elohim there. For he avenges the blood of his children and takes the vengeance of his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not obvious how that figures here, so help us out.
Yeah, and by the way, that's an Advent text. Maybe I'll come back and explain that in a second.
Okay.
You may not know it, but yeah. So if we were to, what you read didn't give me the Masoretic text, by the way. Your English translation is.
Yeah, no, I was sitting there trying to think of what's going on in the Hebrew here, and it was not coming straight through.
So the Masoretic text has rejoice or shout aloud, rejoice, nations, his people, is as ungrammatical as I translated it there.
Yes.
Maybe it's maybe the rejoice nations with his people, or it could be with him. There's different suggestions for changing the pointing, but then it switches tack completely to the blood of his servants being avenged. So that's what you have in the Masoretic text. If you go to the Greek, the Old Greek, it's fascinating. You have 4 clauses for the one at the beginning there. And so 2 of them, like there's 2 different repetitions of roughly the same thing. So you have rejoice heavens with him and bow down to him all the sons of God. And then you have rejoice nations with his people and be strengthened unto him, or something like that. It's a little hard to translate. All angels of God. So what we have in the Greek is what we would call a conflate text. And it's not clear whether this is something that happened in the Greek, although my money is that the Hebrew manuscript he was translating may already have had this conflation. Mark out the key differences for you. First of all, in the Masoretic text, rejoice ye nations, that is on its own. There's not really a great Hebrew parallelism going on to match it. Feels very truncated. Whereas here you have it matched with this, you have it matched with this parallel with the sons of God. Then you have a switch out, like one of the versions that the Greek preserves has heavens instead of nations, which is pretty interesting. And then, of course, one of the two versions has the with him, and one of them has the with his people, which is already kind of like a guess you might have from the Masoretic text about, like, it feels a little ungrammatical, like, what does it mean? But then the second two lines just read like different translations of the same Hebrew, which is why I think that was already in the Hebrew. And when he gets that second line, the translator has to come up with different Greek words. So he does sons of God first, and he does angels of God. What could be behind? Now, this is actually a good example of how we can get the Greek back translation into Hebrew wrong. You might look at that and think, oh, this must be bene Elohim. He must have sons of God sitting in front of him. But you would be wrong about that if you thought it, because when you go and then you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we find in the one copy we have, rejoice heavens. This could be with him or his people. It's not pointed, so we don't know. And then you have, and bow down to him, all gods, Elohim. No sons of God, just gods.
Right.
So since we have the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's likely that that is also what the Greek translator is looking at, that he sees Elohim, gods. He doesn't translate gods. He translates sons of God, and then, when he has it again, he does sons of angels.
By the way, if you go look at this in your own Bible, you will realize there are notes all over the place here. And then in the Hebrew, there's lots of text critical notes all over this verse for these reasons we're saying. That, to me, like, my gut reaction to that is, okay, bow down to him, all gods. You're suggesting that could be an original reading or an original text. That feels very much in the line of the rhetoric of, like, Exodus 14 or Exodus 15.
Yeah.
Kind of the rhetoric of gods with no real intent for you to understand that there are actual gods there, or the rhetoric of anti-God in the sense of what your culture counts as a god. And especially because in Deuteronomy, you have for the first time that I know of, you have the phrase Loel or Lo Elohim, like these are no gods, right?
In Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy 32
Same
here, right?
song, yeah.
Yeah. So you have the rhetoric that these aren't really gods. And so for me, this would actually go against the view that there's some other divine beings involved here at the end. But actually kind of saying, almost like even if there were gods, they would bow down to God, kind of a... I'm sure I'm projecting all over the place here, but how do you take that?
You're reading it very reasonably. It's a very reasonable way to read it.
I take that as a high compliment from you.
No, I mean, in fact, I think you're reading it rather similar to the author, the prophet in Isaiah 43.
I was going to say,
I keep saying we'll come back to that. So I can't really
from Isaiah here, right? So
I can't really come down on you too hard for that. However, I think what Heiser would push back on here is, first of all, you mentioned the not gods verse, which, this is a big poem. Let me see if I can
where
find
is that?
Going on in Deuteronomy 32. It's a very fun.
There is a lot.
We have,
I always have my class when I come up to this. I'm like, okay, we've talked a lot about Deuteronomy, all these repetitions from the rest of the Pentateuch. Here's the song. What do you think is going to be in this song? Just guess what's going to be in the song. Man, they never get it. I wouldn't either if I were them. So.
Okay, so it's this part that deals with other gods is up in 16. They stirred him to jealousy with strange. Actually, just to be clear, gods isn't. It says strange gods in ESV, but it's just strange ones. It doesn't have gods there. Just since we're focused on it, I'm going to be very focused. With abominations, they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. So there's kind of a question here, like, are they gods or are they not?
Right.
Is it calling them gods because they think that they're gods?
Well, and the offense there too, check me before I wreck me. The offense is gods they haven't, you know me. You don't know these gods, right? And you get this in the prophets as well in several places. You don't know these people. So there's this kind of the foreignness of the God that is actually the offense here. And also
it doesn't say
their God.
It doesn't say gods who don't exist. It says, gods you don't know, foreign gods, other gods. And it comes back to this theme in verse 21. They made me jealous with what is no God, provoked me to anger with their idols. Now, here's where Heiser is going to step in. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Okay. The no people there, which is an exactly parallel Hebrew construction to the no gods. Do they really exist in the world or not?
Oh, yeah.
So it's just rhetorical, Heiser would say. It's just rhetorical. This is a use of a non-literal use of nothingness. And so we're saying that no gods means like worthless gods, trivial gods, but they're still gods. And so then when we go out to these other parts of the passage and we find not just sons of God, we just find gods right there in verse 43. The author just is fine calling them gods. He doesn't have this thing we have. He's sure, like Yahweh is the high God. He's on top. He's way above. There's nobody like him. He's special. Not questioning any of that. But they're fine using Elohim and applying it to these other beings. It's just you shouldn't worship them. You Israel, who Yahweh has picked for yourself. The other nations maybe are worshiping these folks because Yahweh has apportioned them to that. He's given them over to that. But you should be worshiping this Elohim, Yahweh.
Yeah. So for those who conceive of the Israelite religion and Christianity that's built upon it as a mainly monotheistic religion, that sounds very much like henotheism, where you have one chief god and then you have sub-gods under it, or at least one worship god. So how is that not henotheism? Or will we just say it's basically a henotheistic system, or like polytheism plus a supreme god?
I don't think Heiser wants to say that. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what Heiser says makes the difference is once you have at least the uniqueness of Yahweh is still important. He would say Yahweh is species unique. So basically, like, it's just maybe we shouldn't focus so much on the word God.
Right.
Yeah, they have stuff in common with Yahweh. We do too. We're in his image. But like we're still elevating him so high that we are putting him. So it's not just these are a bunch of equal options. Choose who you want to worship. But actually, only Yahweh should be worshipped because he's categorically different. It just doesn't have to do with the word Elohim or divine. However, a bunch of other scholars have just jumped on, now cite Heiser in this line of recent research as just, it's not monotheist. Bible's not monotheist. Monotheist is an unhelpful term, and we just need to chuck it. So I don't think, Heiser doesn't want to go all the way to where that line of research wants to go, but he did also sort of set it up.
Yes. Well, and I think what this really demands you to do is to reconceptualize deity and godhood, which most Christians have not spent a lot of time thinking about that. Ironically, they have with Jesus, but not very many other places. I think that, and this is where I will side with Rick Wadholm on the whole issue, and it really makes me nervous, is I'm fine with all that. And when I teach this, I'm like, look, they are really not concerned about whether you believe there are other gods or not. Like you work your way through the Pentateuch and you're freaking out about them talking about these other gods as if they're real. They are not freaking out at all. They seem to be fine with this. So, but what would seem to be incumbent, just the way the biblical authors lay things out and like examine things, I would expect 3 sentences on these creatures, what they are, where they came from, a theogony, we call it, right? The creation of these creatures themselves. 1 sentence in Genesis 1, and he created the gods, the Elohim in the heavens on that day or whatever, would do it. And I think it's the silence issue, again, which drives a lot of the literature in Hellenistic Judaism, like the Book of Enoch and other in Jubilees, where they're really filling in the gaps because the biblical authors really, I don't want to say refuse, but they almost refuse to talk about this issue. Yeah. And I take that silence to be instructive. And I feel like Heiser and many other people, and I don't even know if it's a wrong move, but I feel like they take that as an opportunity to explain to you, this is what they're not talking about.
Yeah. again, there may be a balance here, because just coming back to the text criticism, one other thing I do want to say about these different manuscript readings. Usually when I teach text criticism, different manuscript readings, it's typos, right? It's like, oh, this letter looks similar to this letter, and the
Right.
scribe wrote the wrong one.
Yep. Or this
This
word
does not
sounds this
look
way.
like that.
Yeah.
And just to be clear to your audience, this is not an everyday garden variety text critical issue. Don't go away thinking, oh, every chapter of the Hebrew Bible has something this. No, this is like, Heiser argues it's intentional, and he's not the only one. So somebody shares the discomfort of many of us with this God language, and they came along and they cut it out and they edited it. And I find it very hard to argue that it was an accident. It seems like too much of a coincidence. It's part of why I think it is the original reading. So, I mean, my question is there a place of balance that we can stop before we're cutting the verses out of the Bible?
Right, exactly. And that's the part methodologically where I'm just not sure what to do with some of these things. And quite honestly, the kind of stuff I work on doesn't usually hang this narrowly on a few passages reading in a particular way. Okay, well, this has been extremely helpful, and I'm sure that anybody who is still listening to us after an hour of working this out, I'm sure this has been very helpful for you all as well. Jamie Duguid, thank you very much for taking the time to walk us through all this.
Is it possible for me to throw something in there about Isaiah at the end?
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
So, our time is going long, but let me leave you with something brief and that perhaps upends a lot of this. So Deuteronomy 32, I said that it gets used a lot by Isaiah 40 through 55. Heiser, in his article on monotheism, marches through Deuteronomy and says, look, it talks about other gods. We shouldn't call it monotheists. Great. And then he moves on to Isaiah 40 through 55. And when he gets there, he is, in my opinion, completely unconvincing. In fact, Deuteronomy 40 through 55 are weird, comparatively speaking, because not only do they actually not call these beings gods, you even have an oracle in 41 where they're introduced nameless. You only find out Yahweh's even talking to the gods because he says, predict something that's going to happen if you are gods.
Right.
Direct implication, they're not.
Right.
And then you find these phrases that, the scholars will jump on them. I am the Lord and there is no other. And the scholars will say, he's just saying he's unique, not that he's the only God. It gets fixed in Isaiah 40 through 55, and you find formulas like, there is no other God except for me. And these formulas are more explicit than anything in the Hebrew Bible. They're without parallel that I can find anywhere in the context of Israel's neighbors' literature. And yet, he's reading Deuteronomy 32. So it seems like he wants to develop the idea of Deuteronomy 32, the prophet there, to say, actually, no, they're not gods. Don't call them gods. Don't think of them like gods. And so then what do you do if that's also in your Bible? And this is the thing I think some of the new monotheist literature does not take seriously enough. It's true that you still find, even after that point, you find Psalms using the God's language. You'll find people like Paul using the God's language even. But then Paul will stop and say, well, they're called gods. Right? So I actually think that one step we can make theologically here is say, well, what is happening in Isaiah 40 through 55? Let's go back and look at that. And should we have that prophet sitting on our shoulder when we go back to Deuteronomy 32? And maybe that's going to have us read Deuteronomy 32 in a way that maybe we can still use that God language in some sense, but we'll just have to clarify, well, it's not literal or something like that. So I can say a lot more about that, but for the sake of time,
no, that's
I'll leave it there.
Very good commendation. I should also mention before we leave, and thank you for all your wisdom on this, we did not conspire to wear similar shirts today. This was completely by accident. We are not on the same team. I mean, we are, and as brothers in Christ, but we're not trying to team up on anybody. So, Jamie, one last thing for people who are looking for good critiques of Michael Heiser that will both, as I think Rick did, was try to appreciate what he's done and also kind of get into this. Do you know of any good simple critiques that people can read out there?
Not really.
Okay, yeah.
I think
that's why Rick caught a lot of heat, is actually he was kind of the first one to come out and put it in somewhat plain terms.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that it's something that we need to start interacting with more. There may be some stuff out there I just haven't read, but it's mostly been, you can find extreme reactions against what Heiser is saying.
Right.
People just, very upset or retrenching into old traditional readings that don't take into account some of the stuff he's bringing up. But I don't know a lot of careful balance. Oh, I will say though, just specifically on the Genesis 6 issue, which we didn't really talk about here, but I know is in a lot of people's minds, Doug Moo's commentary on Jude and 2 Peter, where he deals with the places where Jude and 2 Peter are probably alluding to that text. He unwinds, well, theologically, how would we think about this as Christians? And what would be the different views we can take? I actually think he does a really good job. So that might be a good place to start as sort of palate cleanser to help us get our heads on, let Doug Moo balance us a little bit. I would just recommend that resource.
And I think in a lot of the organizations that promote Heiser's work, I've noticed they are trying to expose the people who love Heiser, and he really opened the door for them to think about. They're trying to expose them to wider biblical scholarship as well, so that it doesn't become a cult of some sort, which is probably good. Okay, well, Jamie, thank you very much for your help again, for your wisdom, and we might have to call you back because I'm sure we're going to get questions on this one. So,
oh yeah, that'd be fun. I'd love to do it.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.